Okay, so I thought today I would just do a little instructional video kind of explaining the technique that I'm using for stitching the masks. So to start off with, I'm doing a two-piece mask with 4 layers of cotton. And the way that I choose to lay these out is that I have my 2 fronts, basically, which are a single layer, and they have the 1-inch seam allowance on the ear sides. And I have my backs, which are 3 layers each, and they have the smaller seam allowance the whole way around. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that those are lined up with each other pretty nicely. But you only really need to mark the seam allowance on the actual stitch line on the layer that's on top. These other 2 layers are going inside, and so they're pretty inconsequential. So now that I have these, I'm going to take them over to my sewing machine. And let's see. So we're going to begin by stitching the center front seams, which is this curve. So I'm going to hold those 2 together, and using my straight pins, I'm going to start at one end and just mark along that line. There's much debate in the world about the benefits of cross pinning versus pinning on the line. In my particular training, I was taught to pin on the line, but I've worked in shops that have preferred cross pinning. Some people like you to do both. I, given the choice, always pin on the line because I find that it gives me a truer stitch line. It stops the fabric from squidging around as much. And generally it's also easier to pull out while you're stitching. So I'm just going to keep going like that, checking to make sure that my pins are going through the line on both sides. And there we go. The fronts are pinned, and now I'm going to pin the backs. And so again, these are 3 layers each, but I'm treating them as if they're just 1 layer. So these 2 stacks get to live together like they're just like the beginning, the front ones. So kind of flip them over. And just checking both sides as I go to make sure that I'm pinning nice and accurately along my line. And I find that even with the 6 layers of quilter's cotton, I really don't have too much difficulty pinning through. It's thin enough that it doesn't really give me a problem. There we go. Let's get one more pin in there. Great, so now we're ready to stitch our fronts. And I'm just using a very regular straight stitch for this. With a little back stitch in there. Okay, that's 1 and 2. Great, so now that I have my 2 seams stitched, my next step is going to be clipping the seams. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this pair of scissors and I'm just going to even out my seam allowance a little bit here on this one because it's a little bit shaggy in places. Not a problem, I can clip it down. And then just to get that curve to lie nicely, I'm going to go in and clip my seam allowance. And really don't be afraid to get really close to your stitch line. Since we're going to be top stitching this, it really isn't going to impact and make it any less strong. It's just going to make that curve lay nice and smooth against the face. I don't find that you need to cut it really short as long as you clip it. I think our seam allowances are kind of varying between 1/4 and 1/2, just depending on how the cutting goes. So now that I've clipped it, I'm actually not even going to take it over to the ironing board yet. I'm going to go right ahead and do that top stitching. I find it's easier, this is the nose top, this is like kind of the chin, I find it's easier to start the top stitching from the chin. So folding that seam allowance to one side, not splitting it open. I'm going to start down here and do, you know, like 2 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch, whatever helps you away from that seam. It's kind of hard to see here because of the print, but I'm just alongside my seam by about 1/8 of an inch. I'm completely eyeballing this. If it gets a little bit wonky and it goes a little bit off course, that's okay. Really all we're doing is we're locking this seam in place so that if it starts to fray, instead of a hole forming, there will still be fabric behind it. And it'll stop anything from getting through. And it is on a curve, so it's a little bit funny to sew. It's definitely easier to stitch if you take the table off of your machine, so you just have the leg. Go. Nice little top stitched front. Again, this is our front because it's just the one layer. And then we're going to repeat the process with our back. So I've done this a couple of times. I've accidentally opened it up and I've been like, oh no, I cut this wrong. But then I just realized I opened it wrong. So make sure you have 3 and 3 on each side. And then turning that seam allowance to the side, we're going to do this, repeat the process right over here. It's a little bit easier to see on this one because it's less busy of a print, I think. But as I'm going, I'm kind of checking underneath with my hand to make sure that I'm getting all of my seam allowance on the same side. All of that seam allowance will be going inside the mask though, so we won't see it. And I'm just doing a little bit at a time as I kind of advance the fabric with my hands, nice and slowly. Great, so now we're going to go and hit this with the iron, just to kind of get that curve steamed into place. So I've got my iron over here, it's already nice and hot. It's all cotton, so I can use the highest heat and a ton of steam. What I find is really useful for getting this curve in place is the corner of my ironing board. If you have a ham, that's great. If you don't, if you have maybe like some wadded up fabric, anything that you can use to kind of get that curved shape. And then I'm literally just using the side of my iron on the side of the ironing board. And hitting it with some steam to really kind of lock that into place. There we go. There's one. And let's do 2. So you can see on this one that's already been pressed, the combination of the top stitching and the ironing really does help make that like nice curved mask shape. A couple of people have pointed out that if you had 2 of these you could also make a nice bra. So perhaps that's a project for another time. So now we have our front and our back, we just need to put them together. So the next step is to line up our top and our bottom on our stitch lines. So I like to start in the middle and work my way. I like to do the middle and the edges and then work out. So taking my pin, I'm going to go up to my center line and get that on both of them. go. And you usually have to kind of fiddle with the fabric a little bit to find how it wants to lay naturally to get it to line up there. There we go. So I've got my top pinned. Now I'm going to go to the edge. And remember, the front has wider seam allowance on it on the side than the back does, because that's going to turn into our fold-over casing. But I can still kind of lock the side in place as well. And I'll stick a pin there in the middle to hold that in place too. Nice. And then repeating the process with the other side of the top. Corner to corner. And one in the middle. Great, so there's our top pinned together, and now we're going to pin the bottom as well. So I'm going to flip that around and do the exact same thing. Oop, lost my pin. Go, there's the middle, and the side. Great, so that's the bottom, that's half of our bottom stitched in place, and now we'll just come over here and we'll do the other one. I said stitched in place, pinned in place, of course. Great, so now this is all pinned in place at the top and bottom. So the next thing to do is just stitch those together. I'm not starting all the way over here with my stitch line because, again, this is just one layer of fabric on the edge. I'm going to start stitching about where the second layer starts in. There we go. So still in the seam allowance to kind of lock the whole thing in place, but and again, this is a curve, so it's a little bit trickier, but just go nice and go whatever speed you need to go at to get it to stay on that line. But again, if it goes off a little bit, it's not going to be the end of the world. Now that I'm at the center, I'm just going to drop my needle in, pivot, because that top really is kind of a corner. Alright, that's our top stitched, and now we're going to stitch our bottom. Okay, so we're going to kind of continue our pattern. Now that we've got these stitched, the next thing to do is clip them, just like we did on our center front seam. Alright, threads clipped, and then just going to even this out a little bit down here because we've got a lot of extra fabric hanging out we don't really need. Sure. And then I'm going to go in and clip these curves again. And so again, don't be afraid to get close to that stitch line. As long as you don't clip through it, you'll be okay. And clipping those curves will just allow us to get that nice curve shape. Allow the fabric to move. Same thing on the bottom, especially in the middle. Okay, so now that our seams are clipped, we get to flip her inside out and see what we've got. I think this one's going to be really cute because I like these two prints together a lot. And it looks a little bit funky right when you first flip it out. So then kind of go through, grab your nose corner, pull that out. And the next thing we're going to do is the top stitching, which will really help everything lay nice and flat. I like to do this with the top layer on top. So there's my bottom with the 3 layers, there's my top layer with the 1 layer and the longer seam allowances on the side. And so again, I'm not going to press this before I do it, I'm just going to kind of pull it nice and tight with my fingers. And then I'm going to get in there and, again, I'm not measuring this in any way. I'm just going right along the edge, maybe 1/8 of an inch away, because I think that's attractive. But it doesn't have to be exactly that. And I'm going to go along and lock that into place. This is definitely another one where I stop frequently to readjust my fabric. Make sure that everything's laying nicely. So we just top stitched the top, and now we're going to top stitch the bottom. And again, just kind of feeling it out with my hands, getting it nice and flat. Give it a little tension, pull it into place. And stitch it. Especially once you get to that center point, it's a good place to kind of feel around and get your hold again on the fabric. But even if your line isn't perfectly straight, or you have to stop a couple of times and maybe rethread something, suddenly your bobbin runs out and you have to start again. Even if it's not entirely perfect, it's still going to get the job done, which is to really hold it in place so that it keeps its shape. And now we're going to take that back over to the ironing board and stick that back on the corner and give it another hit of steam. Really press that down. Cotton is so sturdy. You can do a lot to cotton. You're not gonna mess anything up. Okay, very good. So now it's nice and smooth, and there's just one more step. So now, if we look at our back side, we've got our longer fronts extending over, As you can see, they're a little bit uneven. That's fine. We know that there's an inch of seam allowance in here because that's what we cut it with. If you look, there's the line is still inside, but we don't need to really pay attention. I'm just going to eyeball that inch. So I'm going to fold it down maybe a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch or something, and then fold it over another time. About that much. So I know that those two measurements together are about an inch. It's close enough. It's fine. And I'll stitch that down. And so that'll hide our raw edge, and it'll also create our lovely fold-over casing. I'm just kind of feeding that in as it goes so that it lines up nicely with the edge. Clip in our threads. And repeat on the other side. If it helps you to get out the ruler or the measuring tape and get a quick measurement on this, that's totally fine. I find it's faster for me to just eyeball it. There we go. And I'm just going to hit that with the iron one more time to really kind of lock those sides in place, get them nice and flat. And there we go. So we have our finished mask, minus this one thread. There we go. Our finished mask, which is now ready for elastic to be inserted through the sides. Don't have our elastic yet. We will soon. So then we'll go in and we'll put the elastic in all of these. But there it is. I hope this was helpful. If anyone has any questions about any of the techniques that I used, just let me know. I would love to help. And happy stitching, everyone!